Hello there, welcome back to the channel. It's absolutely fantastic to see you guys all here again. And today I'm out here because I want to explain a recent photo shoot that I did. Now, disclaimer at the very beginning, this is actually what I would classify as a reenactment. And the reason for that is I'm not at the same location where I shot the image because I can't get back there right at the moment. And I've got a little prop here, which you can see this lantern, which I'm holding in my hand. Hopefully you can see that. And essentially, this is also not the same lantern I used in my original shot. So they're all the disclaimers. But I'm going to demonstrate the shot that I took. And I'm out here, well, in the middle of nowhere again. Strangely enough, I just parked the car here and 3 trucks just went past. It's like Bourke Street. Now, those of you who don't live in Melbourne or near Melbourne haven't got a clue where Bourke Street is. It's the main street of Melbourne, a big city. So anyway, it's just a figure of speech. That's my Aussie lingo coming out. It's been a while. Anyway, so I'm going to go through, talk to you about this shot and explain the details. Now, before I get too far into this video, I just want to explain something. Now, before I put out the last video, I asked you guys to submit some photos of yours just so that I could show some work that is based off of my fine art light painting techniques. And I was inundated with images. And the reason I haven't got around to that is because I've got over 100 people have sent me images. So that's more than 100 images. And I'm trying to work out how I'm going to actually fit all of that into a video, because there's no way knowing I could go through all of those images in just one video. So you'll have to bear with me. I'm trying to work out how I'm going to do that. But I haven't forgotten about you. I've got some beautiful images and some wonderful shots to show you all. So I will get to that. But in the meantime, let's have a look at this fence post here and I'll talk about this current image. All right, so you're gonna have to bear with me a little bit because this little lantern really doesn't do this fence post justice. The lantern I used is bigger, probably twice as big, maybe 2.5 times as big. But nevertheless, this is going to illustrate the shot. Now, initially I set out to do a time lapse, and I was out on a farm and I wanted to shoot a lantern on top of a rugged old fence post just like this one and shoot the Milky Way rising up behind the lantern. Now, the concept behind that image is to have the camera fairly close and focus on the lantern, not have the stars in focus. And when I do that, and I've done it on quite a few occasions, I want to make sure that the focus is not just a little bit out of focus, because that looks bad. I want to make sure that focus is quite large. In other words, sort of like a bokeh. And to do that, you need to use a lens that will open quite wide. So I use my Nikon Z6 and my Nikon 35mm f1.8s lens, and I shot it wide open at f1.8. Okay, so by having the camera fairly close, I was probably about maybe 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters at the most away from the lantern, and focusing and taking my time to make sure I'm focused on the lantern. What that does is compresses the shot, the plane of focus, very narrow, and everything in the distant background becomes out of focus. So you get that beautiful bokeh stars, and that's exactly the look that I was after. Now, when looking at setting up for a shot like this, you have to make sure that you get your camera low enough down to make sure that the foreground subject has a clean, uninterrupted sky background. So you can see the lantern sitting here. If you look down from the angle where this camera is, it's not being intersected by those trees down there on the horizon. Now, there were trees on the horizon, a bit closer actually than those, but they were off to the left of the frame. So where the lantern is here, it was clear sky. And that's important because when and this is for time lapse or for still shots or for anything really, what's in the background. Now, I did a video on this, I don't know, a couple of years ago, talking about concentrating on making sure that the background is clear, because this happens to all of us all the time. And we find ourselves shooting nightscapes because we're not even concentrating on the background. We're thinking more of the stars, yes, in the sky, and the foreground, yes, like this lantern, but we forget about things that are in the medium distance, and they will often interrupt our view, and therefore the lantern and some of the post here will be cut off, and it just doesn't look as good. So sometimes you have to compromise. In fact, nightscape shooting photography is full of compromise every single time you go out. But in this case, I was able to isolate. I knew where the Milky Way was going to come up over there. How do I know that? Well, there's a couple of ways I know that. I can use photo pills as an augmented reality, set it up and look over there and say, yep, that's exactly where it is. I've talked to you a lot about how to locate the Milky Way, and I'm talking about the Milky Way core, because when I shot this, the Milky Way core was rising up probably about midnight, up to about 1 a.m., even later than that. So it was pretty late. You can just use a compass. I knew if I point my compass to anywhere between 110, 120, 130 degrees southeast, here where I am in Australia in the Southern Hemisphere, I'm going to get the Milky Way. The Milky Way core is huge. It's not that hard to find. I'm in dark sky location and it helps a lot. But my uninterrupted view of this lantern was critical for me to get the effect that I was after. So I want you to remember that this is not the same location, so things look a bit different here. But one of my critical compositional elements was the barbed wire fence. Now this is very similar. It's got this old rusty barbed wire fence connecting to this fence post, and I wanted to include some of that. Now a lot of you are going to say, oh, well, of course you include that because it's pretty close to the subject. Well, let me talk to you about one critical factor. Whenever I'm shooting time lapses, I know that my final product is going to be cropped to a 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, what does that mean? My initial camera is shooting in 3:2 aspect ratio, which means I'm going to crop either the top or the bottom or both when I crop it to 16:9. So oftentimes you'll find that what's down here in your 3:2 aspect ratio, when you crop it to 16:9, you lose it. So I was really keen to make sure I still had this part of the fence in my shot because I felt that was really important. Now, I'll give you a clue as to how I did that. I set my camera initially into video mode. When you put your camera into video mode, it defaults to 16:9 aspect ratio. So for framing up the subject, I put my camera into video mode. Therefore, it's incorporating the bars on the top and bottom. I know exactly how I'm going to crop it later on. Just made sure I got this fence and the edge of the post in and my lantern, made sure the top was in the shot, and I had still enough background to get my Milky Way core rising up. Okay, so once I had my composition sorted out, I just put my camera back into its normal photo shooting mode to get ready for my time lapse. So how did I shoot the time lapse? Well, what I did, I'm using a Nikon Z6. Now, I've been playing around a lot with the internal built-in time-lapse feature, and it works really well. There's a couple of different time-lapse ways of shooting with these Z cameras. And so I decided to go into interval shooting mode. And what that does, it just takes as many photos as I program it in to take, and you can program in your shutter speed plus the interval depending on the settings. So I've got my camera in manual mode. Remember, I opened my aperture right up to f1.8. I decided my shutter speed was going to be 10 seconds and my ISO I set to 4000 ISO. Now, how do I work out those settings? Well, it's quite simple. I just want a whole collection of individual frames that are exposed the same. So I just take some test shots. I work out what I think is going to work. Remember, I need to open my aperture wide open because I want to get those stars as that bokeh blobby, round, beautiful round circles. And that's my aim here. And I also want to ensure the focus is on the lantern and the post, not on the stars. So I shoot at f1.8. My shutter speed, I know at 35mm focal length, needs to be about 10 seconds. Because I'm shooting a time lapse, it doesn't really matter as much if you get a little bit of elongation because they're all being joined together and the stars appear to move anyway. So you get that, I guess you'd call it inbuilt motion blur, which you often have with time lapse anyway. So anyway, I set it at 10 seconds. I know that works well. So as far as the ISO goes, well, of course, that's always the last thing I set. I could have shot this at far less than 4000 ISO because this is an ISO invariant camera. But I sort of like the concept of being able to see on the screen what my image is going to look like. I often push this camera much further than that. So anyway, ISO 4000, that was my settings. And then I decided, well, how long do I want this to be? It's just simply a matter of doing the mathematics. So I took, in the end, 850 frames. So I set it to 850. I know that if I multiply 850 times 10 and also times the 3-second interval, which I decided to program in, then I end up with about 3 hours, about 3¼ hours I think it was out there shooting for, which worked out quite well because I set the camera going, then went back inside, had a cup of tea, watched something on television, I don't know what it was, because I was at the location on the farmhouse, and yeah, set my alarm. So I had a bit of a nap. It's great, you can do all these things with time lapse, and I set my alarm to go off in 3¼ hours, which is exactly what I did. So I set all that up, clicking away. The other thing that I enabled on the camera was electronic shutter. Now I've been playing a bit with the electronic shutter, and I don't know a whole lot about the electronic shutter because I don't usually use it for my photography, but for these time lapses I've been enabling it, and the reason for that is because I'm saving the actual shutter wear and the shutter count on the camera. So that's another plus with these cameras. It works fantastically. So I'm taking 800, 900, 1,000 images in one go without adding to my shutter count. So I reckon that's a pretty good thing. Now, one last thing I do need to mention before I get too carried away here is I had to light this scene because it was pitch black out here. And of course, you're not going to see anything but a silhouette of that lantern unless I have some form of lighting. So I decided to use my trusty Z96 video lights. And I love these because they go right down to a very low level. Now, of course, you could use other lights. You could use Lume Cubes or some other light that, as long as you can dim it right down to almost nothing. Because remember, when I'm opening up that aperture to, in this case, f1.8, and using quite a high ISO, it's really easy to blow out the scene. So I had to be really careful. I set this on its lowest level and put this lantern on an angle. Remember, the camera is here, so I've got my lantern down about, my light about here and right across the fence line. So there's probably a 90-degree angle from my camera to my light, and that's something I always do. If you've followed my channel, you know I do that all the time. I had 2 lights because I wanted to make sure there was, if you like, in portrait photography terms, a key light and a fill light. So I had one light here shining down that way, the other light down the other end, about where that little tree is, you can see there, shining back. And I had one just a fraction brighter than the other because I want the shape of the light to show. I want to be able to see the definition of that light. And so the time lapse looks absolutely fabulous. So I set up each of these images on my timeline in Lightroom, did some initial edits on the first image, and then I selected every image and pressed sync to sync up all the settings. And that's how I do it, including that 16:9 crop, as you can see there. And from there, well, I added some noise reduction just to make sure that it was a cleaner image. And as you can see, there's fairly minimal edits on this frame, on all of these frames. Then I went to the export folder and I exported this via LR Timelapse, which renders this out into a video sequence to get my final time lapse. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed the time lapse, but you know what? I decided after shooting the time lapse, and this is later on after I'd finished all the post-production and everything, I'd done all the edits on the time lapse, that I wonder if I could just squeeze a star trail out of this, because I already had the collection of images and I thought it would look completely different because of that out of focus trails and that really bokeh background. So what I decided to do was I used about 530, I think it was, shots. Now the reason I didn't use the whole 850 was because towards the end of the exposure there was a whole heap of aeroplanes started going through. And of course the aeroplanes are also blobby out of focus, as you saw in the the time lapse. And I thought to myself, well, with the actual star trails, with those blobs of aeroplanes going through on funny angles, I don't think it would look good. So I decided to limit it to about 530. And I was really, really surprised with that image. The thing that stands out on both the time lapse and the star trails is the actual vibrance of the colors that you're seeing there. Now, there's always a lot of talk about star trail and color of stars. Now, we all know that stars are not all white. There's blue, yellows, reds, and all sorts of different shades in between. And you can quite obviously see from both the time lapse and my star trail that I shot here, the colors are very vibrant. And I shot this, remember, at a very high ISO of 4000. So people talk about how to retain colors in star trails quite frequently, and they talk about lowering the ISO right down. I didn't do that here, but I've got heaps of color. Now, perhaps it's got something to do with the fact that everything was defocused on the stars. I'm not too sure, but my experiments do prove that theory, that if you focus on the foreground and light appropriately for that, it doesn't seem to matter what your ISO and your aperture settings and your shutter speed settings are. You'll still get great color in your stars. All right, so there you have it, a quick little video talking about my little photo shoot with the lantern out on the fence post. You know, I love these creative, sort of a little bit different types of shoots. And I like to try and stretch my creative boundaries from time to time. And you know, what I've found is you discover all sorts of new things when you do that. And I think it's a good practice for us all to follow anyway. So thanks so much for watching. Look, I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up and a like on this video, and I'll be looking forward to catching up with you down the track. So have a fantastic week. I'll see you later.